Well, welcome back, folks, to the second episode of American Genesis, the creation of America's scripture. Someone asked me the other day, said, "What do you mean by this?" Well, remember, Genesis is the beginning. That's what we call it in the Bible, the beginning. And as far as labeling America's scripture, scripture is authoritative text. It's also sacred text, obviously, but it means the authoritative text. And this is what this nation was built on. The documents that we're going to be looking at and the historical events surrounding them. So let's get started by listening to a little Lee Greenwood.
If tomorrow all the things were lost I'd worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife, I'd thank my lucky stars to be living here today, 'cause the flag still stands for freedom and they can't take that away. And I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the men who died and gave that right to me. And I'd gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA.
Okay, well, let's review what we talked about last week. Last week, we began this whole new series called American Genesis, the creation of American scripture. And the focus of the presentations are going to be on the writing of these three foundational documents, the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights. We began our look back at the historical events which led to the writing of the Declaration of Independence. Remember, it wasn't written in a vacuum. There were things happening that caused Thomas Jefferson primarily to write this document. And that's what we're looked at last week. It's what we're going to be looking at this week. We first saw how the French and Indian War impacted the American colonists' desire to become independent. Remember, there wasn't a lot of desire for independence. In fact, there was almost none after the war. Things began to happen. One of them was Great Britain tried to limit the expansion into the new territories that they gained, that Trans-Appalachian area. And, the Americans didn't like that. They wanted to expand out there. And Great Britain said, not so fast. We're going to control this. Well, the Americans said, we're going anyway. And then they began a taxation program because they felt like, and not surprisingly, they felt like the American colonies ought to help pay for this very expensive war that had just been fought. Remember, this was a $2 trillion war in today's economy. We learned how the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, two of these acts that they passed, really alienated the colonies, amongst others. And as a result, there began to be more violent protests, primarily led by the Bostonians. They were the ringleaders of all this. The culmination of all this was finally the Boston Massacre, which many historians kind of believe was the first act of the Revolutionary War. It wasn't a big, obviously the 5 people who lost their lives thought it was big and their families, but it wasn't a real huge event but it was the first act. So, trivia question. I thought I'd throw some trivia questions at you during these presentations. The battles of Lexington and Concord Bridge are considered the first large-scale acts of the Revolutionary War. We're going to talk about it in a minute. It was the focus of a famous poem by what 19th century poet? Well, the poet was Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote Concord Hymn, which was written for the 1837 dedication of an obelisk monument in Concord, Massachusetts. Emerson, by the way, was a resident of Concord. That was the old family estate, the old manse. That house is still standing, and it exalted the general spirit of the Revolution and freedom. This poem did. Many feel it was inspired by his grandfather, who had actually witnessed the Battle of Concord Bridge. The poem, of course, is remembered for those famous lines here: once the battle farmer stood and fired shots around the world. And of course, that is engraved on the Minuteman statue there at Concord Bridge. I've been very fortunate. My wife had a sister that lived in the Boston area for 25 years, and we've made several trips back east to visit her. And of course, being the historian that I am, I insisted that we visit all these places. So I'm really familiar with this area. I've seen almost all these places that we're going to be talking about in the next few weeks. So the next event that took place after the Boston Massacre, by the way, most of those British soldiers were found innocent, was the Boston Tea Party. Now, what happened here was this. The British, realizing that the Americans were just really going to violently protest this, decided to kind of, I won't say they gave in, but they rescinded most of what was called the Townshend Acts that we talked about last week, except for the tax on tea. Then in 1773, the British elected a brand new parliament who had pledged to punish the American colonies. Most of the British people didn't like the fact that Parliament gave in. And so they threw those guys out and elected a whole brand new parliament who had said, hey, you put us in and we'll take care of this. And so they passed another Tea Act. And once again, this outcry of no taxation without representation was raised in the colonies. This became the big, anthem of the colonies: no taxation without representation. This time it was much more organized. Prior to that, it had been just kind of a loosey-goosey type operation. Now you begin to see some really strong, dedicated organization led by a group of people called the Sons of Liberty. This was kind of a secret society that had formed that was dedicated toward violently resisting the importation of tea to the colonies. They said, hey, if you're going to raise the tax on teas, then we're going to take care of the tea. In October of 1773, 7 ships carrying tea from the East India Company, which had a monopoly on tea imports, were sent to the colonies for them landing in Boston Harbor. Now, the leader of the Sons of Liberty was Samuel Adams, the cousin of John Adams, who, of course, was a famous founder and the second president of the United States. Samuel Adams was a pretty strong rebel. In fact, he is the generally accepted leader of the Patriot resistance leading up to the Revolutionary War. Well, he sounded the alarm. He said, hey, there's a bunch of ships landing here in our harbor. It's got a whole bunch of tea. And a group of about 100 Sons of Liberty dressed up as Mohawk Indians. Nobody was fooled by this. I don't think they really ever intended anybody to think they were really Indians, but they dressed up as Indians. They boarded 3 of the ships, and over the next 3 hours, they dumped a bunch of tea, 342 chests of tea, into the harbor. Folks, this wasn't just an act of defiance. This was $1.7 million worth of tea in today's dollars. I mean, we're talking some major hurt here on the part of the Sons of Liberty. Now, Britain was just furious. When word reached Britain a couple of weeks later, the politicians and there had been politicians that were considered friends of the American colonies and were really kind of, fighting on behalf of them. They said, hey, this is ridiculous. I mean, that was hurting their pocketbook. Most of these guys were wealthy individuals in Parliament. The immediate reaction was the closing of Boston Harbor. And Parliament then enacted a whole new series of acts known as the Coercive Acts. We know them better as the Intolerable Acts. So let's look back at a very short film here about the Boston Tea Party.
Nathan's clients are so happy with the benefits packages he proposed. He's getting minimal questions.
December 16th, 1773, Boston Harbor. By the end of the night, 342 chests of tea would be dumped into the harbor. Known as the Boston Tea Party, this event was a protest against taxation and British mercantilism. In some ways, the event had been brewing for 10 years. Following the end of the French and Indian War, Britain wanted to tax the colonies and regain some of the money that had been spent for their protection. This violated two principles. First, the idea that the colonies were governed directly by the king. Second, the theory of mercantilism, which said that a mother country would protect the colonies since they provided a vast amount of income. As Parliament tried to take control and levy taxes, American colonists protested. A series of acts and taxes led to boycotts, protests, and creative resistance. By 1773, Parliament had repealed most of the unpopular tax acts. However, the Tea Act remained. Created by Parliament to financially rescue the floundering East India Tea Company, the Tea Act gave a monopoly and several other financial breaks to the company, allowing them to exclusively sell tea in the American colonies.
Had a brush with the East India Trading Company, did we? Pirate?
When 3 ships of the East India Tea Company stood off Boston Harbor, protesting colonists refused to allow the ships to unload the cargo. But the Royalist governor of Massachusetts refused to allow the ships to leave. On September 16th, the Sons of Liberty reacted. Putting on disguises inspired by the Native American Mohawk tribe warriors, the colonists headed for the harbor. Their costumes had symbolic meaning, since both British and colonials recognized Native Americans as a group that did not want to be ruled by European powers. The disguised Sons of Liberty boarded the 3 ships, and for the next 3 hours diligently unloaded the tea into Boston Harbor. It's estimated that 92,000 pounds of tea were emptied into Boston Harbor that night, and the estimated value of that lost cargo was around $1,700,000 in modern U.S. currency. Samuel Adams, a leader of the Sons of Liberty, insisted that the Boston Tea Party was not the actions of a mob, but rather a protest of colonists who were asserting the idea, no taxation without representation. The British governor, Parliament, and the King viewed the Boston Tea Party as rebellion, and in response instituted the Intolerable Acts, which included closing the Boston Harbor to trade. Though the start of the American Revolution and the shot heard round the world was still more than a year and a half away, the Boston Tea Party was a major moment in the road to rebellion and eventual independence for the American colonies. John Adams, a relative of Samuel Adams, noted in his diary a few days after the Boston Tea Party, "This is the most magnificent movement of all. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the patriots that I greatly admire. The people should never rise without doing something to be remembered, something notable and striking. This destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, and it must have so important consequences and so lasting that I can't but consider it as an epocha in history."
Okay, so now we've got a really violent act that's taken place. It's hurt the British pocketbook. That was where it really hurt. So how did the colonists react to this? Well, first of all, the colonists decided that once these intolerable acts were passed, that they needed to get together and try to come up with some organized, protest. So they held in September and October 1774 what has become known as the First Continental Congress. Delegates from all the colonies except Georgia met in Philadelphia to devise kind of a coordinated strategy to protest these intolerable acts. By the way, Georgia didn't attend because they were busy fighting a Native American assault on their colony, and they needed the British armaments. So they did not want to become involved with this protest at that time. The result was drawing up something called the Declaration of Resolves, written by a man by the name of John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. Doesn't get very much credit, but should get a lot of credit. That included an embargo on British trade goods, as well as sending a petition to the king pleading for a redress of their grievances and repeal the Intolerable Acts. So they said, hey, if you're gonna continue this, if you're going to pass these intolerable acts, then we're going to stop buying goods that you ship over here. We're going to place an embargo on it. And, we want this stopped. Not surprisingly, King George III in Parliament said, yeah, well, that's not going to happen. We're going to take control of this situation. He said these colonists are out of control. So what did they do? They sent more troops to America to combat this growing rebellion that they saw. By the spring of 1775, several months later, a growing number of the colonial leaders were convinced that war with Great Britain was inevitable. More and more, people were becoming decisive, and they said, hey, it's inevitable. We're going to have to fight the British. Of course, nobody even thought that could happen. I mean, you're talking about a ragtag little bunch of colonies fighting the major power of the world. They had just defeated France in a global war. I mean, how in the world were we going to defeat the biggest, power in the world? Well, the governor, he thought, you guys are just being silly. So he dissolved the House of Burgesses, which was the governing body of colonial leaders that had been allowed by Great Britain to set certain acts and laws and govern themselves. We had some sort of self-government in the colonies. They end up, the royal governor ended up dissolving these House of Burgesses because the House of Burgesses of Virginia had proclaimed support for the British boycott. The reaction was that the Virginia leaders, they got together and they convened their own convention, and they said, hey, how are we going to react to this? What are we going to do? Well, it was a divided convention. Some people said, hey, we can't fight the British. There's no way we can do this. Others were adamant that a fight was necessary, one of those being Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was a rebel. I mean, he was thoroughly a rebel. On the 3rd of March in 1775, he stood up at the meeting of this convention, and he made a proposal to arm the Virginia militia, and gave an impassioned speech advocating armed rebellion. And it is during this speech that he gave those famous words that we all have heard of: give me liberty or give me death. And although many of the convention didn't share his passion by any means at all, the proposal of the armed militia did pass, and another step was taken towards open revolution. So let's just listen to a little snippet of this speech that Patrick Henry made. This is someone who is, dressed up as Patrick Henry, giving a speech in the very same church that this was given at originally.
We have no election. Even if we were base enough to desire it, it is already too late to retire from the conflict. There is no retreat, but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged, their clanking may be heard upon the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable.
Oh, indeed.
And let it come, sir. I repeat it, sir. Let it come.
Hear, hear. Hear.
The gentlemen want peace. Peace.
Time.
But there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it the gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Oh, forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death.
So you can see how impassioned Patrick Henry was, and he was one of the leaders of the early revolutionary movement in the United States in these 13 colonies. Well, what happened next? You notice that he said there that the war has actually begun. Well, it had. It had actually begun, even though no one had really understood exactly what was going on. Following the Boston Tea Party, the British Parliament declared Massachusetts to be in a state of revolution. Remember, Massachusetts Bay Colony was the primary leader of all this rebellion that was happening. So they sent about 700 British troops to Boston, and they were told, you find all the munitions, all the armaments of these rebels, and you get rid of them. There was a rumor that most of them was located in the little village of Concord outside of Boston. They said also, you need to arrest some of the leaders. Samuel Adams, who was the acknowledged leader of the Sons of Liberty and was the major leader of the rebellion in Boston, as well as John Hancock, who of course would become much more famous later for his huge signature on the Declaration of Independence. And John Hancock was a very, very, very wealthy man. And they were ordered to arrest these two and presumably hang them, for treason. On the night of 18th of April, 1775, British troops began a secretive movement towards Concord to the west. This was the event that led to Paul Revere making his famous midnight ride. We've all heard about that. Where the signal from the Old North Church. I've been there, still standing. Just as the sun was rising, the British troops were confronted at Lexington Green before you get to Concord. Just a very small little village, was then anyway. And the battle ensued, resulting in the death of 8 militia and 1 British soldier. Not a huge event, but an important event because the British, had now lost a soldier. So they were advanced on to Concord Bridge, which is just a few miles down the road. About 11 o'clock, they met 400 militia, and they only were about 100 British troops. Now, remember, folks, the British Army is the army of all armies at this time in the world. I mean, nobody thought that anybody could defeat the British Army, let alone a bunch of ragtag Minutemen, which is what they called themselves. They said call themselves Minutemen so they could be, arise in a minute's notice and proceed to wherever they needed to be to defend themselves. The British troops were vastly outnumbered, and the American militia fought a different kind of battle than they were used to. They didn't just fight standing up face to face like the British troops were used to. They were firing. They had taken. Remember, they had learned from the Indians how to fight. We looked at that last week during the French and Indian War, and they fought for the trees. They've used snipers, the sharpshooters. It was just an annihilation almost. Ralph Waldo Emerson, of course, would write that famous poem, the Concord Hymn, and the Battle of Concord Bridge is, the famous shot heard around the world. And this is a picture of Lexington Green with the statue of a Minuteman, and this is the famous Concord Bridge. I don't believe that's the actual bridge. This is a replica now because the actual one is long since gone, but this is where it stood, and it's replicated just like the original bridge. So let's look at a short film about the Battle of Lexington and Concord.
By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flags to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world. Those words by the American poet and Concord native Ralph Waldo Emerson get to the crux of what took place here on Wednesday morning, April 19th, 1775, when Patriot and militia units returned fire into the British across the bridge that's behind me, triggering the 8-year odyssey that would become the American War of Independence, also known as the American Revolution. Issues like taxation, representation, respect were at the core of the struggle, and nowhere more was that felt than here in Massachusetts. In early April 1775, Governor General Thomas Gage, commander and military governor of Massachusetts, decided he needed to take action to diffuse the hostile relations between the countryside and the city of Boston. At 10 p.m. on April 18, 1775, Colonel Francis Smith and his adjutant, Major John Pitcairn, lead 800 troops west from Boston. Objective: Concord. Seize the weapons, seize the munitions, return them to Boston, and put an end to colonial hostility. By 5 o'clock in the morning, they are on the verge of reaching the town of Lexington. But express riders and William Dawes had gotten out ahead of them to spread what became known as the Lexington Alarm, arousing the countryside, raising shot, having bells rung so that Patriot and militia and Minuteman groups could form and could react to the British presence. 70 Minutemen under the command of Captain John Parker gather at Buckman's Tavern in Lexington adjacent to the Green. At 5:30, they get word that the British are in sight. Parker takes his men out of the tavern, crosses over the Green, lines his men up in 2 rows deep, 70 men total, not blocking the road, merely standing there to show their defiance and their anger and hostility. Parker was not looking for a fight. The fight, rather, came to Parker as the British troops came on, entered the Green, and faced off against Parker and his men. Parker recognized that he was outnumbered, but he did tell his men, stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. But a shot rings out, and nobody's sure where that shot came from. And the British instinctively fire a volley. 17 fall, either wounded or killed. By the time the British reach Concord at 9 in the morning, Patriot units, militia units, Minutemen units from towns like Acton, Sudbury, Lincoln, Bedford begin to converge here. They can see the smoke curling from the town of Concord. The British are burning the guns, the carriages that they found. They've cut down the Liberty Pole. They're burning that too. But it looks to the Minutemen that the town is being fired, and it is decided to march on the town and either die defending it or die trying to defend it. At the head of the band of Minutemen that is going to march on the bridge, he turns to Isaac Davis, the 30-year-old popular captain of the Acton Minutemen, and asks Davis if his men are ready to take the lead. Davis says, I haven't a man that's afraid to go. The British initially hold a ridge across the river on the western bank, but as soon as they see the numbers, they know they're outnumbered, and they pull back across the bridge, tearing up planks as they retreat. As the Patriot units near the bridge, a volley breaks out, and Davis and several of his men are hit and fall. Davis mortally wounded. Shortly thereafter, dies. From the back of the line runs Major John Buttrick of Concord saying, for God's sakes, men, fire! For God's sakes, fellow soldiers, fire! And the Americans unleash a volley into the British. That's the shot heard around the world. British troops fall, and the British flee the bridge in panic, heading back to Concord. But it is going to be one hell of a return march. For the Minutemen who know the area, have now raced to outflank the British and to meet them along the road that will take them back to Boston. The British are stunned. They're now being fired on by thousands of Minutemen who have converged from 27 towns, and for the next 6 hours, it is a running gunfight between the British and militia and Minuteman units, and nothing has been the same on this planet since. And so began the arduous 8-year journey of the American Revolution and War for Independence.
Okay, so you saw there how, the American colonists, the Minutemen, they've just absolutely preyed upon the British Army as they were in retreat. The British they did not expect this. They thought it would just be a mere little battle and that they would whip up on these rude American colonists. All of a sudden, they realized what a battle on their hands. Finally, they made it back to Charlestown and Boston, really wounded. But they were soon surrounded. 15,000 armed Minutemen. The American colonists in Britain were not going to put up with this. Now, the British force was 6,000 men in the Boston Charter. but they were vastly outnumbered. And on top of that, they were surrounded. So by the 16th of June, the Patriot militia had seized two of the largest hills that were located on the Charlestown Peninsula. Boston doesn't look like it does now. It was a peninsula. And they seized these hills, Bunker and Breed's Hill. And that next morning, the British troops decided we're going to have to assault these fortifications, particularly the one on Breed's Hill, because they knew that the American rebels had the high ground. And so they began an assault up this hill. I've been to Breed's Hill, I've been to Bunker's, and they're right in the middle of Boston, and they're huge hills. And they were able to capture this hill and drive the American militia back across the peninsula. It's called the Battle of Bunker Hill, even though it was actually fought on Breed's Hill. It's one of those little idiosyncrasies of war that sometimes gets messed up. It was a tactical victory for the British, but it's a sobering experience for the British Army. They realized between Lexington and Concord, and between this Battle of Bunker Hill, they realized we've got a real battle on our hands, folks. This is not going to be just some pushover thing where we're going to go in and they're going to fold up and throw their weapons down and say, we're sorry. They understood that they had a huge battle on their hands. Now, this is the monument, atop Bunker Hill. Again, it's all got messed up there in geography, but that's okay. That sort of things happen. Well, how did the American leaders, how did the people down in the rest of the colonies react to all this violence occurring up here in Boston? Well, it just so happened that the colonies had got together for another Continental Congress. They had already had one to protest the Intolerable Acts and all, and now they got together again, and this Continental Congress would end up remaining and would actually lead the nation during the Revolutionary War. The main topic at this point was, what are we going to do, to kind of slow this thing down? Because a lot of the delegates in the rest of the other states, they didn't like what was happening. First of all, they viewed the Bostonians, the New Englanders, as rabble rousers and troublemakers. They thought people like Samuel Adams was they understood the concept of revolution. They understood the concept of independence, but they didn't like the way it was going. As a result, the Congress decided they were going to put somebody in charge of this ragtag bunch of army, this 15,000 soldiers that had surrounded the British Army in Charlestown and Boston. And the man, of course, they appointed with George Washington, who had gained a huge reputation during the French and Indian War, fighting for the British. Okay, a lot of people don't remember this about him, but he was actually gained his army experience from fighting with the British in the French and Indian War. And they sent George Washington to Boston to take charge of the now 20,000 Patriot troops, these Minutemen surrounding this city of Boston. And in the months after the Battle of Bunker Hill, a stalemate occurred. The British couldn't break through the American colonies. Obviously, the Minutemen didn't feel like they had the forces that would enable them to charge into the city and win. And so what began was a siege of Boston, which lasted for the next 10 months. And what was going on during this 10 months of this stalemate, this first year of the actual American Revolution, was that loyalists out in the countryside. Remember, folks, there's not a lot of support for this rebellion at this point in time in the country. And a lot of the loyalists moved into British-controlled Boston. Those supporters of the rebellion that lived inside Boston moved out. So you had a consolidation of the forces going on. The siege continued until Washington seized what is known as Dorchester Heights on the 4th of March, 1776. And this is very important because Henry Knox had seized a bunch of cannon from a fort up in Canada at Fort Ticonderoga. And he had brought these cannon to Boston. uh, had them sent over there. And they were now in the position of Washington, who controlled the heights around Boston, Dorchester Heights. And Washington began bombarding the British Navy. Remember, folks, the British Navy is even bigger than the British Army. They ruled the seas. All of a sudden, the British realized we're in a heck of a situation here. We've got Washington pounding our ships to pieces, and we can't get out of here. So they decided, the British Army decided that they were going to evacuate the city. And so by August of 1776, the British had assembled a massive army of over 35,000, the largest expeditionary British force up to that point, and were preparing to launch an all-out invasion on Long Island. The Revolutionary War had began in earnest at this point. So here's a painting of Washington looking over at the British Navy that he is pounding with these cannon seized from Fort Ticonderoga by Henry Knox. So one last thing needs to be talked about before we quit today. Up to this point, this was all kind of a disorganized rebellion because nobody had yet come up with a real cohesive theme to persuade the people of the American colonists to support this revolution. Again, it's estimated that a very small percentage of the people in the American colonies actually supported the revolution in the beginning. Some people estimate that even at the end of the Revolutionary War, there was still only a support of about 40% of the people in America for revolution. Nobody knows that for sure, but that's what a lot of historians believe. Most people in America thought that they were fighting for the lifting of taxes. And once the taxes were returned, they would just go back to the status quo. They were British citizens. They didn't have any idea that they wanted to be independent at this point for the most part. No one had really made a persuasive argument for independence. That was all going to change in January of 1776. A man by the name of Thomas Payne, who had just come from England just about a year before, he absolutely despised the King of England. And so he wrote a 50-page pamphlet that probably had more impact upon the swaying of bringing the working class Americans, the common man, to the point where they were going to accept this revolution. He wrote this pamphlet called Common Sense. As many as 500,000 copies were distributed during the Revolutionary War. Folks, that means that per capita sales in America is one of the biggest selling books ever in American history. There weren't very many more than 500,000 people in the American colonies at this point. Common Sense provided a new and convincing argument for independence by advocating a complete break, because he said we have to repudiate this whole concept of monarchy and aristocracy. He said these were institutions of the devil. He was very much involved with the religious significance of the battle. He further stated that this whole concept of the monarchy violated the laws of nature, human reason, and the universal order of things, which began with God. Instead, he advocated the use of common sense based on the belief that ordinary people could make sound judgments on major political issues, thus refuting the claims of traditional institutions of government that were existed through aristocratic rule. Folks, think about this for a second. What he's saying is this: at this point in time, we have enough sense and enough of knowledge that we ought to be able to make sound judgments on what kind of government we want. Folks, that challenged the whole concept of government all over the world. Most governments at this point were made up of absolute monarchies, with some of them, like England, had a parliament. But for the most part, most countries were ruled by a person or a very, very small group of people. So let's look at a very short film. This is where we'll finish up today on Thomas Paine and common sense.
As the war entered its second year, many Americans still hoped to avoid a complete break with the British Empire. But even as news of the defeat in Canada reached Continental Congress in Philadelphia, support for an absolute break with Britain was growing. Where was this sentiment coming from? While the politicians bickered, people across the colonies were reading an argument for independence that was far more powerful than any yet made by an American. In January of 1776, Thomas Paine, an Englishman who had been in the American colonies for less than 2 years, assaulted the concept of peace with Britain, scoffing at the idea that King George III should be viewed as the symbolic father of the country. Of more worth is one honest man to society, and in the sight of God, than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived, Payne wrote. He went on to refer to the king as the royal brute of Great Britain, before hacking away at the idea that the mother country nurtured America and made her rich within the British Empire. Nothing can be more fallacious than that kind of argument, Payne declared. Payne stated that America suffered because of its connection to England due to the endless European wars that it had been dragged into. He also argued that the distance between America and England, along with their stark difference in size, were other arguments for independence. There is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island, he wrote. Payne insisted that a new era in politics is struck, and that all proposals for reconciliation made no sense since blood had been shed. Payne backed this argument with a claim that it was now America's mission to be a champion of liberty. In bold language, the 47-page pamphlet went on to call for complete independence from Britain, arguing that it was common sense to stop following the royal brute. He declared that the American struggle was not simply one over taxes, but a struggle for freedom. Payne argued that citizens, not kings and queens, should make their laws. The pamphlet caught the attention of Americans, changing the way many of them viewed the king. It made very strong arguments for creating economic freedom for America, as well as the colonists' right to military self-defense. Payne cried out against tyranny, and the public listened as 120,000 copies of Common Sense rolled off the presses in the first 3 months. This is equivalent to selling almost 20 million books in modern America. Common Sense went through 25 printings in 1776 alone, selling more than 500,000 copies in America and Europe. It was printed in multiple newspapers and read at town meetings throughout the colonies. Payne published the work anonymously and donated the royalties to George Washington's army, not only galvanizing the call to war, but helping to fund it as well.
Okay, well, that's it for today. So now we are at the point where we're going to see the writing of the Declaration of Independence. Now there is a movement amongst the leaders. They've got, the battle has ensued. We've got Thomas Paine writing Common Sense, and the people have decided it is time to declare our independence. Well, the people, when I say that, I'm talking about the leaders of the country. And so next week, we're going to see how the Declaration of Independence was written and what's in it, kind of review it real rapidly and kind of go through this. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I know I have immensely, and I hope that you will listen up and kind of refresh your memories. I'm sure a lot of you remember a lot of this, but it's a good time in America to kind of review how we got started, our genesis, because there's a lot of interest in how our country is run right now, and I think it's a good idea for us to go back and look at how this country was envisioned to be by those people that founded it in the first place. So I appreciate you guys. I hope you've learned something or at least refreshed your memories. So until next week, we will see you.
Thank you. Okay.
What do they call it?
I think it's a gurney, but anyway.